Okay, we are here with my man Kozby. Please introduce yourself, sir, and give us a little background history.
All right, Kozby, also known as Moncell, also known as the Funky Mojo, also sometimes known as the Professor. Been dancing since the 80s. Uh, Met Stretch in 92
Yep.
and was inspired by Mop Top in the 80s, seeing them in a lot of different videos to want to dance for a career. I lived in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, is where I actually met Stretch. He was on tour. And yeah, that just seeing the videos of the 80s was a really inspiration for me to want to dance as a career. And then I had some opportunities with Stretch, and eventually I ended up moving to Philly and worked with Rennie Harris Pure Movement for about 10 years. Stretch doesn't know this, but he's been a friend from day one, and so one of the first things he said to me was move to New York. But I was always hesitant to move to New York. I just couldn't understand how people could afford to live in New York City, so it weirded me out, and I never did it. But we stayed friends, and then I ended up actually getting to dance with the crew that inspired me to do it in the first place. And so paths, I've had many different paths along the years, but it's just been a great journey, and it's still going. And at some point I realized that I really enjoy teaching more than I enjoy performing. And so I pursued a career in teaching dance.
And you're currently
currently the assistant professor of practice is my official title at the University of Southern California, which is the first university to offer hip hop classes as a part of their major BFA program. So it's mandatory that you have to take hip hop. So in other words, if you come into the program and you're like a prima ballerina, that's all you want to do is do ballet, or that's all you've been doing, you have to take hip hop. Or if all you've ever done is hip hop, you have to take ballet. So it's a major part of the program. And even if you haven't had ballet training, you can get into school with just hip hop.
Nice. So, take us down the road of vernacular jazz to hip hop. For me, over the last, I'd say 12, 13 years of learning, basically that all of what we do has been done just in another form to another sound. And that's why we're trying to, I guess, enlighten our folks to, that truth. So, give some background. What exactly is vernacular jazz?
Well, vernacular, it was coined by a guy named Marshall Stearns. Vernacular just means movement or language of a people where you find them at, where you find them doing the dance or doing whatever craft making, whatever expression they're doing. Vernacular just means that, where you find the people in their lived experience, in their environment. And so for Marshall Stern's use of the word vernacular was really to pinpoint the dances that he saw African American people doing in their neighborhoods at that time in Harlem.
Okay. And give us some background on some of the names of the dances.
All right. So for jazz music, authentic, or what some people call authentic jazz dancing, consists of tap dance, solo jazz dances, and the Lindy Hop. Tapping is pretty clear. I think Lindy Hop is pretty clear for most people. What they get confused on is the solo jazz dancing. So solo jazz dance is the Charleston, or steps like the Black Bottom, or what a Susie Q or trucking or all these different dances that are just individual dances. Excuse me. That lose my voice. That people would do. It's similar to what we do in hip hop. So if you think about the '80s, you know, we did the Running Man, and you did the Roger Rabbit, and you did the Alf. The same thing you saw in the '60s, where you did the twist, you did the swim. Well, with vernacular jazz, it's the same thing. It's a bunch of dances that have individual names. They're not really complicated steps. They're not supposed to be complicated. That way, anybody can do them, and that there's supposed to be something that's inclusive of anybody in the party, not a specialty thing.
Right. So it's almost as if, you know, it's a community based movement, sort of just like hip hop.
Yeah, yeah.
The
Yeah.
precursor to what we call street dance.
Yeah, I mean that's how I think about it. To me, vernacular jazz is like the grandfather or grandparent to hip hop, because so what I look at there's three particular people that I look at, and that's Charlie Atkins, James Brown, and Michael Jackson. Charlie Atkins, and I'll condense this, but Charlie Atkins was a tapper of the famous tapper with the team Coles and Atkins. Later in his career, pretty much after he kind of retired from tap dancing, he became the choreographer for Motown. So everything that he taught Motown, outside of like how to enter a stage, how to exit a stage, how to stand at the microphone, he taught them soft shoe steps and tap steps and all the vernacular jazz dances from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So here are these groups in the 60s doing all this movement from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Some of that movement was over 60 years old, particularly stuff with tap. And so when you're teaching Gladys Knight and the Pips or the Temptations or the Miracles, they're doing steps, which means the young people that are admiring them are starting to copy those steps,
Right.
which are like my parents, Stretch's parents.
Right.
And then so that just gets, there's an influence there. And then you have people like James Brown, who was Charlie Atkins. I believe Charlie Atkins was born in 1913. James Brown was born in 1933. And when James was coming up, somewhere around 8 or 9, one of the dances that was one of the big dances in the 1940s was a step called the Applejack. And that's when you see James go on one leg, that comes out of the Applejack. So James did that his whole career. James has a big influence on the hip hop community of copying James. And James is copying or doing the dances that were popular in the 30s and 40s. James also was a huge fan of tap, and so his footwork comes from the influence of tap dancing. A lot of his knee drops and splits come from the influence of tap. So this is the movement that's circulating in the African American community. It's what you see your elders doing, cousins, parents, grandparents, and you're kind of copying that as kids. It goes on. Michael brings it full circle because Michael admired James. Michael, not just the black community, but you know, he admired Fred Astaire, but a lot of stuff Fred Astaire got was from the African American community as well. But Michael kind of brings it full circle where not only did he do what people like James Brown did and Charlie Atkins and Jackie Wilson, Michael also picked up what was current in his era. So growing up in the 60s and 70s, he started doing those dances. Then he incorporated locking, he incorporated popping. He got with Stretch. He was influenced by hip hop already and got with Stretch and then influenced that. So we kind of see things in a kind of roundabout way kind of come full circle with his influence, but then still doing dances that are hundreds of years old. You know, Michael would do the shout when he's like kind of hopping around on one leg, kicking his one leg up and his head back. That comes from a step called the shout, which comes from the ring shout, which was a spiritual dance that enslaved Africans did in the 1700s. Michael was also at Motown, and so Charlie Atkins didn't work with kid groups, but the Jackson 5 would watch the studio sessions when he was teaching, you know, Gladys Knight and the Pips, and they would see the steps that he was doing, and they would incorporate it in their routines. And like one of the steps that the Jacksons did, they did the drop Charleston. They did it a little bit different. There's a 1970 clip of them on the Ed Sullivan Show It's on YouTube, and you can see them doing like what b-boys call a Charlie Rock, but it is part of the Drop Charleston, which is a vernacular jazz dance. And you also see outside of the African American community where Elvis Presley would do he would do the Applejack, but there's another step to the Applejack that's kind of like stepping your feet inward, and that's what when people say when they imitate Elvis. Well, you're imitating Elvis, who's imitating the Applejack, which is a jazz dance.
I can't remember the guy's name. The clip with he does like the slide.
Earl Snake Hips Tucker?
Snake Hips. So that's who Elvis is impersonating.
Probably so.
Yeah.
Like, and yeah.
Well, his influence, because it seems like, you know, the movement of the hips and the knees.
Yeah.
That's all snake hips.
Yeah, which was huge in the vernacular time. In the 40s and 30s, 40s, that was a huge movement. And even what Snake Hips is doing, he's doing. There's two versions of the camel walk.
Right.
He's doing the camel walk. But he's doing, so there's a camel walk where you see him doing this.
Right.
And so when you do that camel walk, kind of like your hands don't have to be on your hip, but you're doing this movement.
Right.
And then you're doing this with your neck.
Right.
And then the other camel walk is the one we kind of walk
Right.
forward.
That James Brown made popular.
Yeah.
Now it's funny if you look at the camel walk that Snake Hips is doing in the clip with the rolls
Right.
and the movement. It looks a lot like popping and a move called the ET, you know, and it's just to show that, you know, everything is interconnected.
Yeah.
So my next question is how are you going about trying to disseminate this information for people, these connections to things? Like, what is your thought process on how to teach this?
Well, one is to like get to the. That's a really involved question. All right, one thing is this: to as far as the movement is concerned, get to the root of the movement. In other words, take all the personal, stylized way of doing the step, and let's just get to bare bones. And so, what are the mechanics of the body? And I think a lot of us, we teach the same thing and we have different language for it. So, for example, I'll do this, like, well, everybody does this, right? And I'll call this the pecking because it's of a 30s dance called pecking.
Mm-hmm.
Sabela calls this chicken neck. We're
Right.
still pecking chicken.
Right.
But it's rocking.
Exactly.
You're rocking. And so there's rocking your neck and knowing what directions that's going, what you can do with your neck. There's so you got like you're rocking your body, you're rolling the body, you're bouncing, and I know I talk a lot about like these 4 bounces in the movement, and I can explain that. But your neck is bouncing, your rib cage, however you want to talk about the torso is bouncing, like everything is bouncing, or everything could be rolling or whatever, and it's looking at those core things that you have to. I don't want to say have to do, but that exist in the movement itself. It's part of what's called the characteristics of behavior. So when you're stripping down the cultural context of it, characteristics of behavior are like having a curved spine, bending at the knees. There's improvisation. There's stylization. There's usually something in hand. Even if you go, over 100 years back, somebody might have a handkerchief, where today they might have a hat, and they're doing all kind of things with the hat.
Hat tricks,
Yeah.
shoe tricks.
Yeah. So there's this idea of something in hand. There's about the community, like you get acknowledgement from your community. You're dancing with your peers. But there's a space for you to be an individual and still be supported by the community. There's also levels of competition. These are all core characteristics you see in African dance that have come, that's still part of the community. And so it's learning that, and it's learning, strengthening one's sense of their hearing in terms of what musicality is and how to sort of become the visual representation for sound. Um, and it's just like, the way you talk, the way you relate to people in the community. These come all of this becomes a part of the practice. So like basically your social cultural experience informs your dance. If you live in a place where there are buzzards, you might have a dance called the buzzard loop. If there are no buzzards, you're not going to have that dance. So if there's like uh, a walk like that you call a diddy bop, that actually goes to some other old movements and dances. But if that's popular in your community, that might become part of the dance. If there are, slang words or anything that's part of the vernacular in your community, you're going to see that in the movement. And so it's understanding what those things are, how you are communicating non-verbally, and what these gestures mean. And so, yeah, I mean, I could go on, but I don't want to.
No, it's cool. I mean, the funny thing is that plays into. We just had a panel discussion when I was in Malaysia, and one of the questions that was asked by one of the young people there was the history and the background of the handshake, and that question was such a good question, because I'm like, okay, this kid is asking something that none of these other kids are thinking about,
Right.
Which all the things that you're describing, it's a cultural identification,
Yeah.
and that's what I was trying to get to him for him to understand, because he was just like astounded by the whole idea of shaking somebody's hand in a particular manner, and he was just like different. He was shocked because he knew about the locker handshake,
Right.
but then he had seen like me and Link do our EF handshake, and then he saw, I guess, stuff in film, so he was like, well, so yeah, let's can you build a little bit on the cultural identification practices and in our vernacular I don't know what words I'm using right now because I'm tripping.
A couple things come to mind. Like for African American people, I don't want this to go down the deep road, dealing with racial issues and everything. But for most African American people here in America, you're still dealing with the residue of slavery, which created a lot of different things. It divided families. It created positive and negative things, and
As with all things.
yeah. And so like some of the things that come out of that, but that existed as a part of Afro-diasporic communities anyway. African communities and Afro-diasporic communities, meaning people who were removed or left Africa,
Right.
in the diaspora. Ways of identifying with each other, ways of connecting, ways of building community and holding on to spirituality were how people came together. So, for example, and I hope this doesn't go left, but a moment ago, I talked about the ring shout. The ring shout was a spiritual. Is a way that Africans held on to their spiritual faith. And so what a ring shout is, and you can find them in Africa, you can find them in Haiti, a ring shout is related to our ciphers. So what a ring shout is like imagine a circle with a vertical line through it and then a horizontal line through it. And in the middle of that is another circle. And at the tips of at the end of each line, so there's a circle here and a vertical line and a circle at the bottom. There's a circle, a horizontal line, and then another circle. Those 4 circles represent the sun, and in the direction that the sun travels counterclockwise.
Yeah.
So in the center circle represents water. The vertical line connects the human world with the spirit world. The horizontal line separates the human world from the spirit world, and it's believed that the spirit was, so the bottom sun represents female, top sun is male, and you connect through water, you get, to the human world. And so if you think about things like in a cipher or in church, people will catch the Holy Spirit, they will catch the Holy Ghost, they'll be speaking in tongues. In a hip hop cipher, kids will black out, they'll go dumb, they'll do the same things where you kind of reach this level of, spiritual awakening where the body's just a vessel and you don't even know what you just did, you just got busy. It's borrowing from that same cultural dynamic. So,
and for those that didn't understand that, it's basically you go into autopilot,
right?
For lack of a easier term,
and just you just go off, and but those types of practices, those types of spiritual practices, practices in style and in the way you dress and setting yourself off to be a little bit different what somebody else is, those are ways that we interact among the community, and they hold value as to how you present who you are, and it's part of the representation. So in representation, you're looking at the images, you're looking at stories, you're looking at memories, and identifying with someone else or the same group going through the same experiences means like, I get it, I get what you're going through, and then you find ways of connecting. So something like a handshake, or in the 60s when they called them power shakes, were really coming off of the civil rights movement and all the black arts movements, black power struggle. And so you'll have something like, when you have a raised fist, which is most commonly with Tommy Smith at the 1968 Olympics, but this was like, I'm down for black power struggle or the black power movement. This went from a political statement to a social statement of what's up. And so you would see somebody like, what's up, or what's up. And it just meant, not only am I connecting with you, I identify you, I'm down with this struggle, and I'm saying what's up at the same time, right? So I'm down. But this goes, then you get power shakes out of that. So this is black power fist, then you get all these crazy power shakes when you're talking about the lockers, and you got the locker handshake, and people coming up with just elaborate things to really assert their identity, their creativity. Because for a long time, going back to slavery, black folks didn't have a voice in America. So you had to be quiet. You couldn't, you couldn't celebrate in that moment. You had to go off into the field and celebrate, or,
celebrate in private.
Right, in private. And so, but this is part of that exchange, and this is what we see now. We're like that, where you're able to be a little bit more vocal and kind of say who you are and celebrate who you are. And you really saw that in the jazz era, where you get the flamboyancy of the styles of dress, and they're coming up with different slang words, and then the music itself, and everything is really pushing you to, because as a community of people, you were supposed to be quiet. And at this time, even though, and I don't want to throw too much stuff out that's like, all right, then I got to go into that whole thing.
So
but in this time, you're dealing with Jim Crow laws, and people, y'all can look up Jim Crow laws.
Google, people. Google is your friend.
And you're dealing with that, so basically it forbade black folks to do certain things. But when you look at the arts, music and dance, these are the areas where people wanted to see that, so they could let loose. And the reason people are like, well, did they dance that fast back then? Hell yeah, because where they couldn't go here, they couldn't eat at this place or sleep at this place or whatever, you couldn't tell them nothing on the dance floor. So all that frustration of how you're dealing with the world, all that comes out on the dance floor, all that comes out in your music, and it just shows creativity. And people who are going through the same experience, they all get that. And so that leads the way for them to do it. Like, they're doing it, I'm doing it, I'm gonna show my voice. And that still exists in the black community, where when it comes to dancing, like, all that's a part of who we are as a people and how we communicate non-verbally. So the way you wear your hair, the way you wear your dress. And it's even interesting because when you think about hair, there's what used to be called the Tignon laws, Tignon. The Tignon laws Google. The Tignon laws basically were some laws set up so African people couldn't wear their hair the way they wore it here. And this is where, like, elaborate, so they had to wear a wrap. And this is where the rap gets popular. You think about Tupac and Handkerchief. This is where all that comes from and getting popular. And the raps, they started to stylize the raps because they couldn't stylize their hair. Unfortunately, at that time, they would cut their hair, which was disrespectful for the African community because how you wore your hair lets you know what station you were in life. It told you who you were in your hometown, in your community. Whether you were a chief, whether you were this kind of worker, whatever you did, your hair told that story. And they would cut their hair. And so to stop them from doing these elaborate hairstyles, because European people thought was distracting, the Tignon laws came up where you had to wrap it. Well, then they started stylizing the wraps. And they started wearing hats. And this is why women, particularly black women, wear the hats that they wear in church. These like really huge, elaborate hats. It's an extension of that style of hair, which they couldn't do. I won't go into everything, but if you look up the Tignon laws, you can get everything. And so you just see as a community of people that originality, individuality, stylization, improvisation, all this is a part of our cultural legacy and our heritage. And it just plays out a little bit different with each generation that comes. But it's just part of who we are, part of our community. It would be like, somebody growing up in, flamenco is a part of their community, or Jewish people growing up and wearing a yarmulke is a part of their community. It's like part of the heritage. So there's meaning and value to how you dress in the community, how you style yourself, how you assert who you are. We hold that very valuable because at one point we didn't have a voice in this country.
And on that note, thank you, Professor Koz.
All right.
This is the Next School Dictionary. Educate yourself, fools. Peace out.
Yeah.